What family secret or hidden backstory were you finally let in on when you were old enough? Number 1. I wasn't so much let in on it as I discovered it. My grandmother died when I was about 8 from lung cancer. I was at her bedside the day she died, and I remember her being bruised all over her face and arms. Years later, as an adult, that fact never sat right with me, so I got a hold of her medical records. It turned out she had been mugged leaving the bank and was basically beaten to death by some guys for resisting. I do understand why my family covered that up. Number 2. I have a niece I didn't know about until I was middle-aged. My oldest sister left home early while I was an oblivious child. Turned out, she'd gotten pregnant as a young teen and went to live with our grandmother to gestate, give birth, and give the baby up for adoption. For decades I never knew, until my sister called during my divorce years later and commented that she knew what it was like to have your life upended because of her daughter. What, she'd never had any other kids, so I realized I was really missing something. Turned out she thought Mom had eventually told me once I was an adult, and Mom thought she had eventually told me, so they both assumed I knew when I had no idea. A few years later her daughter finally reached out from the info on file at the agency, so now she's part of the extended family and my sister is bonus mom. They're both lucky the reunion went well. Number 3. My great-grandfather drank himself to death. My grandmother was ashamed of where she lived. He was the town drunk that spent most weekends in jail. She often had to carry him inside before school because he was passed out on the lawn. They finally told me all of this when I started drinking a handle a day. Number 4. My grandmother left my granddad and she got pregnant. Her lover dumped her. My grandfather took her back along with the baby. They had 2 kids together after that. He always treated her son the same as their 2 kids. I didn't learn any of this until my 50s. Number 5. My great-aunts were almost certainly an incestuous secret lesbian couple. They lived together their entire lives except for like a year when one of them got married. During that time they completely cut contact. After the divorce, they lived together until the day one of them died. They were caught doing things together as young teenagers. We're pretty sure that never stopped. They never showed any real interest in boys. Even when one got married for that year, people thought there was nothing there between them. Number 6. One of my cousins had a baby when she was 17. My aunt and uncle sent her out of state to a hospital where she gave him up for adoption. Years later, after he would have turned 18, my uncle started looking and finally found him years later. He was doing well, had a family of his own. My uncle didn't contact him and only told my aunt and my mom that the boy was fine. They decided that my cousin did not need to know where he was, and she died not knowing what had become of him. I have no idea if any of her siblings ever knew she had given up a child in her youth. If they did, they never said anything. The only reason I know is when I was going over my mom's will, I noticed she had this cousin listed to be my guardian if anything happened to her before I turned 18. I asked her why that cousin, and that's when the story came out. Number 7. My father came home from school one day when he was 12 years old and saw his mother being taken away in an ambulance, and she passed that day. He never told us why or how. A few years ago I saw her death certificate and the cause was self-induced abortion. Number 8. When I was 13 my dad told me that he'd had a child with his first wife, but my half-brother drowned in a swimming pool when he was 3. Only time I ever saw my dad cry. 2. I have an uncle who retired and dropped out of most contact with the family about 25 years ago. When I was in my 20s, my mom told me she keeps one eye open with my uncle, my dad's older brother, and that she knows something having to do with him and my little brother, that if my dad knew about it, he would get on a plane, fly halfway across the country, and murder him on the spot. She passed away before I could ask her more about that, but the implication has haunted me for years. Number 9. When I was a kid, I went to this Science Day camp for a few weeks. We did different things with a few teachers and volunteers, but there was one teacher's assistant who really stuck out to me. We hit it off immediately, and had a blast together every day. During pickup time, the teacher joked to my dad about how her TA and I acted like siblings. I remember my dad being really spacey for the rest of the day, even the week after that. Turns out, the TA and I actually are half-siblings, with the same father. Our dad sat me down a few years later and explained that when he was 18 to 19, he accidentally got his girlfriend pregnant. Both of them were devout Catholics, so she carried the child to term, and abandoned her daughter afterwards. With no other options, he gave his daughter up for adoption. I haven't seen my sister since. Part of me wants to reach out because I have that information, but I'm also a bit nervous, since we're both adults with our own sovereign lives now. Not to mention the 16-year age gap. Number 10, I thought my dad died of natural heart-related problems over 13 years ago. I was 19. I'm 32 now and I just found out about a month ago his death was an intentional suicide by pills and alcohol, and they just didn't want to tell me. Weird side note, his funeral wishes were not respected. His mother, my grandma, pushed for a very Catholic service and burial. My dad was atheist and always very clear he did not want a traditional religious funeral, he wanted to be cremated. He often made fun of religion and kept a flying spaghetti monster magnet on his fridge. It has always just really bothered me someone's final wishes can be so ignored, even by loved ones. Number 11, my great-uncle's career was home robbery. His specialty was getting in second-story windows by climbing on things below, so his nickname was Porch. Number 12, some member of my extended family, 20+ members, were executed in my parent home country for violated some laws, also were to never go back there in fear of being executed as well. Number 13, I found out that my grandmother is actually my step-grandmother and my biological grandmother died a few years ago because of substance abuse. I also found out, on the other side of my family, my granddad, who I've always been very fond of, was an alcoholic and quite abusive. Basically found out why neither of my parents drink. Number 14, my father's childhood. His mother was apparently hanging around sailors a lot, he didn't know his father, she sounds like a prostitute. He would sleep in a bed with his siblings, one day they woke up and the baby was dead. His life was turned around when his grandmother, a force to be reckoned with, found out what was going on and took him away to live with her. He got a loving home, a good education and a start in his chosen career. Number 15, my father's side of the family had the help all the way up until the 70s or so. Their family employed a black woman who resided in a separate part of the home, did almost all the cooking, cleaning, babysat my father and his siblings, etc. But she was not permitted to eat at the same time as my father's family, to say the least. There was an extremely small room off the kitchen she was allowed to eat in by herself after the family had finished their meal. With that said, after my grandparents passed away, my father allocated a portion of his inheritance to her so she would no longer have to work. It wasn't living lavishly or anything, but it was enough to get by. He also insisted absolutely that she be included on family events like holidays and birthdays, because she was also family. I grew up viewing her as like a great aunt.